Hello everyone, welcome back to Eclectic Alo. This is Alina from Argentina. If you haven't subscribed, please do so, and also click the notification bell. Today I'm going to talk about CPTSD, define it, differentiate it from PTSD, and I'm also going to explain what triggers are, what dissociation means, and what flashbacks are, and also we're going to look at the symptoms as well. But throughout the video, I'm going to ask you to write down your questions so that I can make another video, because this is a big subject, okay? Complex psychological trauma happens as a response of repetitive experiences and chronic experiences of stressors. It's not one event, it's many events during a long period of time. It's usually what happens to victims of cults, narcissistic abuse, prisoners of war, political prisoners, people that lived traumatic experiences during a long period of time. And this is very similar to PTSD, but it's complex and more severe. Also, there's this component that during childhood, many people growing up were abused by their caregivers. The person that is supposed to take care of you is the one traumatizing you. So this is why it's complex. You can see how developmentally this is going to be ingrained response. This rewires our brain. This is a rewiring of our brain, but this is a response. This is not that you're flawed or disordered. It's a response to what happened to you. It's your brain taking care of yourself. The brain is a sophisticated machine that is actually so greatly developed that has all these systems that prevent us from dying. It's basically your brain safeguarding your body. And so, for example, during a situation of stress, the fight or flight alarm comes up in the brain. But during trauma, when traumatic events happen, there's this inescapability component, so you can't escape. So the brain freezes the body, makes you freeze. And this is a very intelligent response that the brain is making happen for you to be safe. So it's your brain working for yourself, and in a very healthy way, because that's the best way to cope at the moment, to make you freeze, right? The problem comes when after the trauma has happened and the abuser is gone, you're still having this response. And it's what happens to most survivors. Actually, 20% of people develop CPTSD, PTSD, because we have more data that is related to PTSD. And so CPTSD is quite a newer concept, 1990s. Judith Herman, she was the first one that started talking about the defined CPTSD, which is very similar to PTSD, but it's more severe, it's more complex. So that, as I said, it's with political prisoners, cults, people that have been secluded in cults, domestic violence, domestic abuse, because it's, a long time, right? So when I continue, it happens. And so it's a response that your body comes up with in order to safeguard you. And so you're not weird, you're not flawed, you're not defective. Actually, your body is a sophisticated machine that is saving you from an inescapable situation, and something that is too much for the nervous system to process. So that's the coping mechanism and the defense that we have. People need trauma therapy because after the stressor, after the abuse is long, the abuser is long gone, and you suddenly have these reactions out of nowhere that are called flashbacks, where you, for example, overreact. The situation is a small one, and in the past maybe you would have just ignored it, but right now you cannot let it pass. For example, sometimes it's a situation, you see a situation of unfairness, and then you start yelling at the person and you don't recognize yourself. That's a flashback. You're in a flashback. A flashback could be also, it's the reliving, right? This component of the reliving of what happened and the constant rumination of what happened also. The brain goes back to the abuse, goes back to that, because the brain cannot, I believe the brain can't process it because it's too painful. And so it needs the help of a therapist, the trauma therapist, so that you can process it. And it takes time and patience and a lot of self-compassion and mindfulness. Mindfulness is key. You have to be aware of what you're feeling, write it down, go to your therapist, let them know what you feel. Although it may sound weird to you and you may feel inadequate or weird or something that is not appropriate, but it's so normal. So the therapist knows what you're going through, and if you help the therapist telling them what you really go through and what you feel, the therapist knows in advance the symptoms that you have. So if you name them, that's the way you can get the help that you need. And so don't feel inadequate or weird, okay? Because that's the normal reaction of the brain trying to keep you safe and alive. And in the face of such cruelty, of such anti-human behavior, right? Something that you wouldn't expect from a human, you went through that. So please first feel as if you're the hero, a resilient person. You went through something that is completely unusual. People may live a lifetime without going through these situations, and so you just went through something that is completely and utterly unexpected, damaging and harsh. So you're sort of a war hero, and you have to be compassionate with yourself and know that you will have all the symptoms and that you can get help, because this is a response. This is the big thing. This is the rewiring of the brain. The brain needs to rewire. That's why you still have the symptoms, because in order to survive, the brain needed to create some pathways there. For example, I mentioned this many times, but the amygdala comes up with the flashbacks, and that's when you suddenly may feel sad suddenly because of a trigger, which is, a trigger is things, situations, smells, places that remind you of the abuser or of the event of the abuse, okay? The many different events. That's why it's complex, because you have a wide array of situations that were abusive. And sometimes you didn't even realize. So that's why it's so ingrained in you, and it's difficult to get rid of it. So the flashbacks are the situations where you live this again. The reliving of the trauma is very classical, let's say, and it's a classic. It's not a classic, but it's something that happens, the reliving of the trauma. And so you feel that you're living that again when you saw a trigger, right? A trigger is maybe a smell or a piece of clothing that you used to wear, or suddenly you saw a certain expression that you recognized from your abuser, or a certain way of talking, or an accent, or a place. Anything can be a trigger for you. So it's important to be mindful and recognizing what your triggers are, and that way you can go to therapy with more information so that you can work on, and so that you can know and avoid what you need to avoid for now, right? Until you get better, because this is an ongoing treatment that it may take time, but it can, you can get better, and you can get rid of a lot of the symptoms, if not all of them, and you can improve and get well, because this is not something that is wrong with you. This is the response of your brain to what happened. So you need to rewire again, And there are many things that therapists, we use a lot of, thankfully we have a lot of things that we're finding out in the recent times, moments that a few years ago we didn't know, like 50 years ago we didn't know. But you have a lot of things, like for example mindfulness, yoga, self-care. That's what I insist on, because by being mindful you realize what you're feeling, what the triggers are when you're in a flashback, and so that's how you start to handle that, and then it goes away, right? It takes time, it takes a lot of effort, I know, but since you're already a hero, we have this person that is going to get well. And so that's the good thing. The cool part of working with people with trauma, we're working with people that are resilient. Although you may feel as if you are flawed right now or there's something wrong with you, that's because your brain was coping with too difficult things, right? Things that were inescapable, too hard to handle. So, but your core self is very strong. That's why you survived this, right? So we went through flashbacks, triggers. I wanted to explain dissociation. Dissociation is what happens normally, for example, it's a normal thing that we all do when we are driving down a highway, for example, and we spaced out, like we lose ourselves in our thoughts, we're somewhere else, and then we suddenly go back to the wheel. You're driving and you realize you're almost home, right? So you drove and your mind was somewhere else. Or when we also dissociate when we study, we need to focus, so we need to detach from feelings and from other things that are external things, factors, in order to focus on what we're doing. In order for me to focus right now, I have to dissociate from the noises that I'm hearing, from the birds that are flying by behind that window, or there's a range of let's say it's a continuum. It happens on a continuum, dissociation, right? When it's pathological, it's when you start watching TV for a long time during the day, or you spend your days sleeping, or you are working all the time, and this is another response of the brain in order to keep you safe, because it's painful to process all that stressors, all that abuse. It's painful to be in touch with that, so that's why we dissociate. One interesting thing about dissociation is that there's one risk factor for having PTSD, and that is peri-traumatic dissociation. And that is, for example, when these are out-of-body experiences, when it happens a lot when there's sexual abuse, and the person that is being abused describes him or herself being away and like looking at the situation from above, so completely detached from feelings and thoughts, like numbness. And so that's peri-traumatic dissociation. And if that happened during a traumatic event, it's more likely that you will experience the symptoms of CPTSD or PTSD. And so I have a list here of the symptoms of complex PTSD, which are hopelessness, helplessness, darkness, sort of depressive mood, like you are a lot of sadness, you're experiencing sadness, difficulty controlling your emotions, that happens during the flashbacks, suicidal thoughts, self-harming behaviors, maybe abuse of drugs, alcohol, avoiding friendships, avoiding relationships, avoiding everything that's really healthy, because you don't feel adequate, you feel worthless, you feel damaged, you may feel a lot of shame, guilt, emptiness, feeling like nobody can understand you, because this is a specialty of psychology. So imagine all this. How could you know all this, right? This is a very complex thing that we are finding out now, and we have a lot of tools right now, and more are coming. Like for example, EMDR is very effective in the cases in specific cases and or for specific events, or if you have always the same, for example, flashback brought by a special trigger, EMDR would be great for that, because it sort of annuls, like makes it neutral to you, the experience. And then but it's for specific. Then neurofeedback, we found it's very useful, but this is very new. So, and we have a lot of tools to go to, like mindfulness, because mindfulness makes you be in the moment, and that way you can identify your flashbacks. You know, okay, I'm in a flashback, you can do that, and by doing that you start to manage, you know, and integrate your cognitive part with your body, and tell your body that you're okay, it's just a flashback, and that tends to alleviate the symptoms, a lot of symptoms. So this is a response of your body, and you can rewire your brain back to normal. And there are a lot of management things that you can do with a therapist, work on therapy. Distrustful of others, you feel very paranoid, ruminating, going back to what happened one time again, because this was no ordinary thing, and your brain's trying to understand. It's not because you are particularly obsessive, right? So this obsessiveness of the brain trying to understand what happened, right? That is part of CPTSD, because this was a traumatic event. This is not a regular event, so your brain needs to adjust. Feelings of emptiness, hopelessness, feeling as if you're permanently damaged, worthless, distrust, like paranoid. You see yourself as being paranoid now, and it's completely normal. Yes, if you have any more questions, I don't want this to be a very long video, but if you have more questions, write them down below, let me know, so that I can put another video together and answer your questions. And I will see you next week. Bye bye, have a great week.